Hello, everyone. My name is Deepa Singal, and I am the Scientific Director of the Autism Alliance of Canada. Thank you so much, Mike. We at the Alliance are committed to working with you, other members of Parliament and government to make sure that disability and autism policy receives the attention that it deserves. So it's my honor and privilege this morning to introduce three individuals who are outstanding leaders in the field of autism advocacy and policy. And I'm going to invite our three panelists up to the stage right now. And as they come up, I'll tell you a little bit about them. So Dr. Alistair de Gaetano is a highly respected administrator of the Maltese government. He is a chairperson of their Autism Advisory Council, and he has dedicated his career. This is a little awkward. Go on in. Please have a seat. I'll continue. So Alistair de Gaetano has dedicated his career to advancing the rights and opportunities of autistic people. Dr. Susan Daniels is a leading expert on autism and neurodiversity, and her work as the acting national autism coordinator for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. She's the director of the Office of Autism Research Coordination, and her work has been instrumental in shaping national policy and research initiatives in the United States. Harald Neerland is the president of Autism Europe. He has been a powerful voice in the global autism community for many years and has tirelessly advocated for greater awareness and acceptance of autistic people and has worked to create a more inclusive and supportive world. Together, these three leaders represent the very best in autism advocacy and policy. And despite our regional and cultural differences, there is much that Canada can learn from these experts in other countries who have walked the path before us in developing autism policy. By studying the successes and the challenges of other nations, we can gain valuable insights and ideas that will help us create more impactful and innovative policy that can be tailored to the unique needs of our Canadian communities. And while our countries may differ in some ways, our shared goal of creating a more inclusive and supportive world for autistic individuals is one that unites us all. So thank you so much for being here. And I will invite Alistair to give his presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for having us, first of all. Good morning to everyone, and a big congratulations also to the Alliance and to all the activists here for their work in ensuring that Canada has legislation in order to actually have a national autism strategy. So I just have to see how to switch slides, actually. So how should I switch slides? Sorry. Okay. Perfect. Yes. All right. Wonderful. So I will give you a bit of an overview of the journey which Malta undertook over the last years in actually having a national autism strategy, also legislation, this respect, and most importantly, implementing it, monitoring it, good practices, and also challenges which we actually have faced, because this was also something very new for us. So just like Canada, we also had legislation in place, which was adopted in 2016. So it's the Persons Within the Autism Spectrum Empowerment Act. In the same way as the Canadian bill is structured, there's a number of principles which are laid out. And there's also a direction that on the basis of these principles, which are also pegged to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, government would, within a set time frame, promulgate a national strategy and then proceed to implementing this. The process was slightly delayed also because in the middle of this period, the COVID-19 pandemic hit, unfortunately. So that did force us to take on new modes of working, which did also slow down certain matters such as the consultation process. But the strategy was finally launched in 2021. In this respect, there is also something very specific, which is set up by the legislation. So in the same way that in Canada's legislation, there's the obligation to consult with different ministries and stakeholders in drafting the strategy. and also to hold at least like one national conference in this respect. Our legislation sets up a council, the Autism Advisory Council. So it is similar to councils like in other like countries, for example, IAC in the United States. So it brings together stakeholders from different line ministries that are involved in the autism sector. So it is mainly the ministry responsible for health, for education, inclusion, which is basically the ministry which has the disability portfolio under it, the cross-cutting portfolio, as well as employment, because I will later look at the different aspects of the strategy, and it is a lifelong strategy. So we don't just look at children, however, we actually look at a life course and also at practical measures that are required for when these children actually grow up. Because one of the things that we actually did was also scan and see what other countries have actually implemented by way of strategies. We want to also to avoid, and this is one of the things which I will put out there also for Canada to avoid in this journey going forward, to have a strategy that is either to focus on children or else to focus on the medical aspect. Because children do grow up, as I mentioned, there's certain specific elements such as aging, which our strategy also tackles. And then you also have to make sure that it is about having a person integrated into everyday life, not just about looking at deficits, looking at the triad of impairments, and just like addressing the triad of impairments. There's much more to autism than just that. So yes, basically we had legislation in place, the Autism Advisory Council was set up, and the Autism Advisory Council was the body that was responsible for both drafting matters internally and also reaching out to different stakeholders to engage in pre-consultations, eventually public consultation, to finally have a document that was approved by the Cabinet of Ministers in 2021 and launched as Malta's National Autism Strategy. So, in drafting the strategy, we wanted to make sure it was as broad as possible, but on the same, like in the same breath, also as simple as possible to reach as many people as we could. So the first thing we did was engage in literature review. We looked at strategies from other countries. There are a number of countries in Europe which have like promulgated strategies over the past 10, 15 years. We unfortunately did find that a number of strategies were very focused on children and also on issues such as early intervention, which our strategy also does like touch on. But then again, it is all about the approach. As I mentioned, although the health ministry was on board, although the faculty of medicine and surgery at University of Malta was on board also, we wanted to make sure that we shifted from simply looking at deficits and addressing deficits to a model of neuroaffirming care and neuroaffirming support. I'd also like to add that in the council itself, it is not just the line ministries and the state service provision agency that are represented, but there are also corresponding faculties from the University of Malta, which is Malta's basically own university, as well as the National Disability Regulator, so Malta's monitoring mechanism in terms of the convention, and also NGOs. And with NGOs, there's both NGOs representing autistic people as well as NGOs representing parents. So that way we have a good mixture. And this document was, these different steps that you actually can see were coordinated by this body. So people from different walks of life representing different sectors, but it was also then consulted and fine-tuned with people out there also. So the literature review, we looked at the different like models, the good, the bad, and the ugly, basically. For example, some good examples that we saw, there was a Scottish strategy on autism, where we actually like did use the format that they actually used, whereby in every chapter of the strategy, we have the first section, which is you said. So you have like a number of points, so that we actually gathered through the pre-consultation and the consultation. For example, if it's the medical aspect, we saw, okay, what parents said, what autistic people said, what are your main concerns? So first we have a section about people's concerns with quotes from different people. And then the second part of the chapter, in every chapter, is specific action points. So, okay, these are the main issues that were brought up, for example, in respect of employment, in respect of early intervention and diagnosis. These are the points where we're going to address matters. The pre-consultation process was very important to actually reach out to stakeholders within specific environments. So for example, if we're speaking about education, we actually went to schools, even like in most, there's still a couple of special schools, those are called resource centers. So we actually met with the administration, we met with support officials there, such as social workers, with the parents, with the students, and we actually like wanted to see, okay, what are people's concerns? If it was autistic youth, for example, we actually held town hall events in that respect. If it was when it came to employment, we spoke to different employers. There was issue of advocacy and self-advocacy. We met one-on-one with different activists also. The council also acts as a pass-through for different concerns and cases which are challenged to different ministries. So I also like, so what are the real life cases? For example, people complaining that there's a lot of silos in the medical sector when it comes to diagnosis. So we actually made sure that before we even had the first draft, we had an extensive pre-consultation process, because we could very easily say, okay, so this is what the UN Convention says, this is what certain authors have said, this is what was, for example, addressed in the English autism strategy, for example. But at the end of the day, we had to make sure it was something which was very specific for Malta. There are some very specific challenges. So here in Canada, you can look at the regional element, and even in Malta, okay, it's a tiny country, but then again, there are two main islands, and the challenges, like on both islands, are pretty different. So wanted to make sure to factor those in. So this was the pre-consultation process, and this led us to actually drafting an initial document. The element of nothing about us, without us, which the co-chair actually mentioned this morning, was very important to us also, because at the end of the day, yes, it's important to have experts like in the mix. But then again, this is for autistic people. And Malta has seen a shift over the last few years. It was basically much more difficult for people to be out there if they were autistic. I remember back in 2016, those two of us who actually, let's say, were out, so to say. Many people would not want to speak about the fact that they were autistic. They would be discriminated at work, in their studies. So, and still, I had like, for the previous years, I was not even living in Malta. So, but we wanted to make sure, okay, how shall we make people more comfortable? So we like made sure that in our pre-consultations to factor in the voices of autistic people as much as possible. Would have liked to have more voices, but then again, we had to work with the landscape in the way that it was. So we had to tailor the methods that we used. But it was important to say, okay, who's going to benefit from the strategy? Autistic people. So it would actually be pointless, be useless if their voices were not factored in. Alongside other voices, yes, like families, for example, siblings specifically are also mentioned, even like medical professionals who actually are frontliners. Those views are important. But then again, it should all be about the autistic person. And then once we actually had the final document, first of all, we actually made sure that there was ownership. So with every entity representing the Autism Council, we made sure it was approved at the highest level possible. So Director General level, Ministerial level, CEO level. So with all of the entities there, we made sure that we had like a sign off in writing. The document was sent to the Cabinet of Ministers. We got the approval of Cabinet of Ministers. After that, it was submitted to a public consultation, an accessible public consultation whereby we had standard and easy read versions in Maltese and English. Malta has two written national languages, because there's also multi-sign language, which is an official language. And then after that, we also like had sessions during public consultation, for example, even for like people with intellectual disabilities, autistic people with intellectual disabilities, to actually, so the sessions were run in an accessible way to make sure that everyone could comment on this text, everyone could give their feedback. Again, we updated the text after this again, and we finally then issued the strategy in both standard and easy read versions in Maltese and English. And that is when the implementation process started. So with the strategy itself, I will very soon like also lead to a link. We also have QR codes here for those of you who are interested in accessing the strategy. As I said, there's also an English version. So the name that we finally settled on was Respecting Diversity, Safeguarding Equity. Actually, there is typo there, just realizing now. So it's Respecting Diversity, Safeguarding Equity. So this was like the theme of the National Autism Strategy. And it has a time frame, which is 2021-2030. So it is also pegged to the completion of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and also to Malta's National Disability Strategy. So Malta also has an overarching National Disability Strategy. So there are a lot of points of commonality, just that the National Autism Strategy focuses very specifically on the needs of autistic people. As I said, this was the structure of the different chapters. You said, and we will, and stakeholders for every action point that there is, are all listed in the strategy itself, like in every chapter. So these are, I can also like share like the presentation afterwards, so anyone who would like that. but you have the links and the QR codes. So that's for the standard English version of the National Autism Strategy. The second one is for the easy read version, easy read English version of National Autism Strategy. They're available online through the ministry's website, Ministry for Inclusion's website. So as I said, I can circulate this afterwards. Now I'll just like run very quickly through the priority areas, because I also like know that as with any other strategy, like Canada will also be identifying and focusing certain priority areas. Like yesterday, for example, spoke about housing, spoke about employment, we spoke about post-secondary education. So the first like chapter deals with autism awareness. We're actually having a chat about this yesterday. So it is an important gateway, but it should not be an end in itself. And the importance that this is done in an intersectional manner, in an accessible manner, also respecting different communication needs, non-traditional communication methods, such as AAC. The second part, early identification of autism interventions, we had to cover this, but as I said, the focus is on neuro-affirming care and support, and also tackling certain issues such as over-medication. When it comes to education, there's issues such as transition. Actually, like yesterday, I was very inspired by the network, the university network that was being discussed. So it is one of the things we also like want to make sure that not only are there plans, support plans for students, but also that necessary recommendations are in place and there's the necessary awareness and supports also among peers and professionals. With employment, it's one area which in Malta a lot of work still is being done, still needs to be done. So it's about bringing businesses on board, making sure not only to have accommodations, but also incentives to make businesses like autism friendly and to have a much better integration like to the workforce and job retention specifically for autistic people. Finally, it was very important for us to have advocacy, advocacy and outreach. And in this respect, also look at the regional element, Malta's different regions here also, and also the different groups, for example, youths, also parents, autistic people, and how everyone can play a part. Very importantly, autism and adulthood, especially the issue of intersectionality, for example, capacity to consent, sexual health and reproductive rights, and also the issue of aging, and finally, administrative matters. How could we amend the law further to make sure we could also implement the strategy? And I'll just give a few practical examples that are, so the strategy like was launched in 2021, already working on a number of different elements. These are a few projects which actually came out of the strategy. Pediatric one-stop shop. This is being done together with the Ministry for Health to have like diagnostic and psychological psychiatric support services under one roof, specialized ones. So there are two hubs in the two main regions of Malta. And also there's training like which is being like done for professionals and also like allied, so medical and allied health professionals there to focus on neuro-affirming care. So from when a person gets a diagnosis and also extending, so right now only children actually get a diagnosis on the state systems being also extended to adults, like in a phased manner. With education, there's a project on transitions and post-secondary supports, which I'd like to actually also inform better through the work that Canada is actually doing. Employment and job retentions, one area where we're actually also running European projects with partners from Ireland and Portugal right now in order to have better training for autistic people and also employers. But then again, there's much more work to be done. With self-advocacy, we've seen the birth of Malta's first autistic-led like self-advocacy NGO through the efforts of the Autism Advisory Council in implementing the strategy. Finally, regional outreach. The strategy mentions that with Malta's regional councils in the like 4 different regions of Malta, there should be a focused like approach. This is one of the things which we're actually doing. So it's not just a one-size-fits-all, but different regions actually are like tackled in a different way. Finally, one important thing. So the strategy was made in a simple way on purpose. If you look at our national disability strategy, you have very specific KPIs there. We actually wanted this strategy to be as accessible as possible. But there's also an implementation plan that was adopted by the council. And there you have more specific KPIs. And this is like basically the roadmap which different stakeholders are using to implement the strategy. Government also pledged, the current government in its last elected manifesto proposal, to implement the strategy itself. So I mean, there's added like strength in that. And this also links to funding at the end of the day. So like if government actually has a manifesto pledge to implement national autism strategy specifically, it's pledge 672 of its current manifesto, then government is also obliged. So even like when it comes to advocacy, this was one of the things which was being pushed for by different activists in Malta. Have it as part of your electoral program, because then like we could also make sure that for the reforms necessary, we'll have the resources. There's a quarterly reporting mechanism for different stakeholders. So every like we identify different stakeholders for different like actions. And then like every quarter, we actually send out for feedback. But this is not just monitored by the council, it's only monitored by the monitoring entities on council. So we also amended the law to specify who's going to implement and who's going to monitor. So these would be the regulator, university, faculties, and civil society entities to make sure that there's a clear split from the ministries. So if there's any red flags to be pointed out, like this can be done independently, and then the implementing entities have to follow up on this. There's a participatory element, nothing about us without us, as I mentioned before, and also breaking of silos. It's something which is very problematic in Malta. So the reason we actually had the council and the reason we actually have the system for implementation and monitoring is to make sure that somebody has an overview of what's going on, and that like people are, so to say, forced to work together or obliged to work together, because the issue with Malta, even though it was a small country, was that everybody was doing their own thing, and the people who actually worked in the short end of the stick were autistic people and their families. And with better coordination, like it comes to implementation and monitoring, we're actually going past that. That's it from my side. This is the email address of the Autism Advisory Council. Like, feel free to reach out to me at any point, and I'm happy to discuss any questions. Thank you so much. Very nice. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for having me here this morning. It's exciting to know that you have new legislation in Canada. We're thrilled for you, and congratulations on all the hard work it took to get to that point. I'm going to be sharing with you this morning about what we've been doing in the United States. Oh, it was just a little bit slow. So I'm going to be sharing about autism policy in the US. So with our US government, I'm going to be giving you some background about the context of our autism work within the larger disability framework, and some of the different structures that we have in place for autism coordination in the United States. So first of all, just wanted to say that we have a robust set of laws in place for disability rights in the United States in that first bubble, including the Rehabilitation Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that provides a general framework for disabilities. And we also have special legislation around certain disabilities that has resulted in disability-related federal advisory committees around the US government. But in 2006, we had autism-specific legislation, the Combating Autism Act. And since then, it's been reauthorized several times, and that resulted in the formation of the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, which I manage, and also the establishment of a National Autism Coordinator in 2014, and I'm the acting National Autism Coordinator. So this is just a rundown of some of those different pieces of legislation in case you're interested in some of the disability legislation we have, but rights across many different sectors for people with disabilities. So within our framework for US federal autism coordination, we had originally the Combating Autism Act of 2006 and subsequent legislation to ensure that there would be public input into the federal policymaking effort for autism, and it includes autistic individuals and family members as a part of that law, as well as advocates and service providers and researchers. And the goal of the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee that was established under this first law was to foster communication and collaboration across the many different federal agencies and non-federal partners that are working in this space, and to provide support for autism research, services, and policy that really meets the needs of individuals on the autism spectrum and their families. So since the Combating Autism Act of 2006, which required a national strategic plan for research at first, and this was, the first plan was issued in 2009. We've had subsequent legislation, and the legislation has changed names. Now the name is the Autism Cares Act, and the last version we had was in 2019. And since the initial Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee was established, it has grown. We have 23 different federal departments and agencies represented on the committee, as well as advocates and family members and autistic individuals on this committee. And we currently have 42 members of the committee. And the strategic plan has now expanded to cover research services and support. So it started in the research space and has expanded over time. So with the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, it's as I said, a federal advisory committee, and it does have federal members as well as public members. And it provides this forum for discussion with the public, and we have public comments where people can share emerging issues from the community. And one of their roles is to provide advice and recommendations to the Secretary of Health and Human Services on autism. And they also provide advice that is used by other federal agencies. The National Autism Coordinator, and I'm the acting National Autism Coordinator, does coordination of the implementation of the strategic plan across the agencies. And I run the Federal Interagency Work Group on Autism. That is a group of federal agencies that get together on a regular basis to discuss the ongoing implementation of autism activities across the government. And I also run the Office of Autism Research Coordination at the National Institute of Mental Health, and that provides support for the committee and for the National Autism Coordinator. The role of other federal agencies and disability-related federal advisory committees is also very important as a part of the entire environment. And so my role as acting National Autism Coordinator is to monitor the activities of federal advisory committees and activities across the federal government on autism. So I oversee the National Autism Research Services and Support activities. We convene the Federal Interagency Work Group on Autism, ensure that the strategic plan is being implemented, and coordinate across many different agencies. And as you can imagine, with so many different agencies involved, this is really helpful to get together on a regular basis to do that. And we are facilitating exchange of information across agencies and preventing unnecessary duplication of effort. And some of the other disability-related committees we have in the US government include the Recognize, Assist, Include, Support, and Engage, Raise Family Caregiving Act Advisory Council, which deals with family caregiver issues for people with disabilities and also the elderly. The President's Committee for People with Intellectual Disabilities, the Interagency Committee on Disability Research, the Federal Partners in Transition that deals with youth with disabilities, the National Advisory Committee on Individuals with Disabilities and Disasters, and the National Council on Disability, which is its own federal agency on disability. So as you can see, there are a lot of different efforts going on, and we want to make sure that there's not duplication. And our committee, the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, is really focusing on autism-specific issues and adding information into the space. So with the IAC, we have, as I said, membership including 23 federal agencies and departments, and currently 19 public members that represent diverse backgrounds. And this includes family members, autistic adults, and leaders of advocacy, research, and services organizations. And I just wanted to show you a picture of our committee. It's the largest and most diverse committee we've had to date, which has been really exciting to work with. And we develop an annual update, a strategic plan for autism, which I'm going to be talking about, as I know that you're going to be embarking on developing your strategic plan. We also, with the committee, develop an annual summary of advances in autism research and monitor autism activities across the government and across the private sector. And part of how we do that is we actually collect data on research that's being funded across the United States. We also monitor services and support activities and issue reports. And we provide recommendations to the Secretary. And you can see from the pictures, we've been doing a lot of meetings in Zoom lately. We hope to be returning to a hybrid format, but it's been helpful to be able to keep the continuity of the committee. So some important things to keep in mind about the committee is it's advisory in its nature. And so we get together, take in all the input from the public, and create a unified strategic plan. And this provides advice to the government, but it is up to the government to allocate funding and implement federal programs. So the committee does not control funding and it does not do the implementation. So we have a new strategic plan that's going to be coming out in the next several weeks. We worked on it for the past year and a half with the new committee, and it was approved in January. So we were really excited about that. And this is the 8th edition of our strategic plan. So it's really grown over the years, and I'm going to share with you a little bit about how it was created and what's in it. So as I said, we have a lot of input that came in from across many different areas of the community, including autistic individuals, family members, researchers, clinicians, service providers, educators, advocacy organizations, and importantly, with the IACC, again, federal agencies are there together with members of the public to share input for the strategic plan. And the 7 areas that were original to the strategic plan were all focused on research, but each of those sections also now contains broader recommendations that can be applied to services and supports and policy as well. So the 7 original areas covered by the strategic plan are screening and diagnosis, biology of autism, genetic and environmental factors, interventions, services and supports, lifespan issues, and infrastructure and prevalence. And we've kept that same structure because we've been tracking it over time. And if we change the structure, we would lose the tracking. So even though the field has evolved a lot, and if we were creating it brand new today, we probably would organize it differently. We've kept that structure so that we can keep the tracking. And this year with the new strategic plan, we've added standalone sections on equity and disparities, sex and gender, and the impacts of COVID-19 on our community. So these are some examples of different issues that are covered in different areas of the strategic plan, including new and improved screening and diagnostic tools, a reduction in disparities in identification of autism across various communities for the screening and diagnosis section, biology, looking at differences in structure and function of the brain, and also the co-occurring physical and mental health conditions that impact autistic individuals. With genetic and environmental factors, looking at factors that influence the trajectory of development of autism. With interventions, new and improved behavioral and medical interventions, as well as educational and technological approaches. For services and supports, ensuring that there are evidence-based practices that are actually getting into community settings, and that we're reducing disparities in access to services in different parts of our country. And I'm sure that in Canada, you have similar issues to us, that there are variations in access to services in different parts of your country. And so we focused on that in the new strategic plan. The lifespan issues, including needs of adolescents and adults on the autism spectrum, and including areas such as employment, education, life skills, housing, and health. And finally, on infrastructure and prevalence, looking at biobanks, databases, research coordination, and some of the prevalence monitoring and tracking systems, as well as the research workforce. And with the new areas I mentioned with sex and gender, we've now consolidated some of the work related to women and girls on the autism spectrum, and also added in LGBTQIA+ individuals, and looking at ways to serve these communities better, including better identification, supports, and services. In the equity and disparities or intersectionality section of the strategic plan, looking at intersectional identities and their impacts on health and well-being, and developing culturally competent tools and services. And with COVID-19, looking at the health impacts of COVID-19 on the autism community, as well, what are the learnings from that? And there have been some gains and some losses, the loss of services in some areas, and also the gain of new modalities such as telehealth. And the plan also contains a research budget recommendation, and the committee recommended $685 million in research by 2025. So the overall updated priorities of the 2021 to 2023 IACC strategic plan include greater acceptance and inclusion of individuals on the autism spectrum, increased accessibility of services and research for individuals and their families, solutions for people across the entire spectrum, including those with the highest support needs, solutions for people across the entire lifespan, including older autistic adults. And we have a whole new section on older adults and had a session in the strategic planning in the IACC about that issue. Solutions to improve physical and mental health for individuals on the autism spectrum, the intersection of social determinants of health and the services system, and increasing equity and reducing disparities. So the next steps with our new strategic plan are to get it disseminated after the final graphic layout is finished and we're able to publish it online. And for IACC member agencies and non-government partners to help implement the strategic plan. And our office will be tracking progress on the strategic plan and its recommendations. And we'll use reports that we create to inform the IACC for their next update of the strategic plan. So we'd invite you to connect with us if you're interested in following the work that we're doing. We're online, we have a whole website, and our meetings are open to the public online. So the next one is October 11th. And we have an email address, a mailing list, and you can follow us on Twitter. And just wanted to say thank you to the wonderful team in the Office of Autism Research Coordination that makes this work possible. Thank you.
Let's see. First of all, I'd like to thank Deepa and Jonathan and the entire Alliance for actually allowing me to share my experiences on this. Trying to get my notes up so that I sound semi-coherent. And probably more importantly, I'd like to thank everybody in this room for allowing me to listen to your experiences and to point me towards the directions we need to go. Listening to the Grand Chief was painful because one of my, call it pet peeves, for lack of better words, is underserved communities, and there's quite a few of them. And on a personal note, this initiative that you have in the Alliance with a strategy for Canada is actually important to me because I do have a family connection to this valley. So I'm rooting for you guys. So today, I'll actually should say something about Autism Europe. It's an umbrella organization for about 90 national and regional autism organizations. And in relations to what you guys are doing, one of our mantras is a rights-based approach to autism, i.e. the legislation part. So today I'll try to give some context to pan-European legislation on autism and disability. And I'll highlight some of the various approaches that we see to autism in Europe. I'll also touch upon the current work that is ongoing in the field of autism in Europe. And finally, I'll reflect a little bit on which elements that are essential in good plan and strategy. I got to move this this thing forward. The green button it says, but there. So context. Europe covers over 50 nations there's 6 transcontinental nations in there. They're nations politically considered to be European. People would generally think of them as Asian countries like Azerbaijan and Armenia. There are also indigenous people in Europe. People don't seem to think that way, but there are Inuits in Denmark. There are Sampi people in northern Scandinavia. And in this picture, there's just as many political and cultural approaches to autism. So a little bit on the pan-European legal entities, the framework for legal services. Start with, excuse me, start with the Council of Europe, which is the largest element of it. It covers 46 member states. It doesn't really have any legal standing, but it does have a key document, and that is the European Social Charter. From a legal point of view, they do have what's known as the Protocol for Collective Complaints, which allows people to challenge the services of a country with respect to that social charter. Interestingly enough, a collective complaints from Autism Europe towards France caused the first autism strategy in France. And there's also an element that will come up in any of these legal entities, and that is what we call the competency of decision. Anything that deals with health, education, those general elements belongs to the state. It's not an overnational competency in that. Then we got the EU, which has 46 member states. Again, a key element is the social charter. Gotta remember this one. The documents that you see there, the ones that we lean on heavily, but there are others that is important. For instance, the work, it's called work, sorry, it's just disappeared in the back of my head here. So, and there's actually a third unit there, it's the European Free Trade Association. Combined with the EU, it becomes the European Economic Area, and that's for all intents and purposes following EU legislation. And then, of course, we can't forget that one, the UNCRPD. It happens to be the first UN Charter of Human Rights that has been adopted in Europe. So it's ratified by the EU. And that is a very important concept of to bring into this. From a personal point of view, again, the UNCRPD has something called reasonable accommodation. And in discussing with service providers and politicians, the reasonable accommodation is a very powerful word. Unfortunately, the charter turns around and limit that power by introducing something called disproportional burden. You should afford a reasonable accommodation up to a point, which is a bit of an annoying concept. So on the current state of autism in Europe, the ASDU there is a project that Autism Europe was part of that looked at the status of autism in the EU. And that did not cover just autism strategies, it covered legislation also. The focus areas that we found, whoops, that was too many, was in education, healthcare, notably not social care, and employment. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a many-headed animal, Europe, and the approach to autism is far from being uniform, and it's definitely not satisfactory. Most countries rely on general disability legislation, while it is sufficient in some countries, it's not necessarily sufficient to address autism specific needs in all countries. Others have implemented autism-specific legislation, strategies, or plans with varying degree of comprehensiveness, and that's another of my pet expressions. When we're talking about autism, it needs to be comprehensive. But what we have seen, and that's that it's important to note that where countries and regions have an autism plan, have an autism strategy, we see positive impact. Admittedly, not to the end of all goals, but there are definitely positive elements in there. I'd leave the strategies of Malta to Alistair. He's done a good job on explaining that. So I'd like to sort of give a few examples of good strategies that we see. And Alistair made reference to the English strategy and to the Scottish strategy. It turns out that the strategies across the UK tends to be good. England has a strategy that focuses on mental health, diagnosis, employment, education, public awareness, the judicial system. With every positive element, there's a negative side too. Funding past the first year is uncertain. I'll get back to funding after later. Scotland has a very neat concept. They have a one-stop shop, which is essential when you're a parent looking for what the heck is going on. Northern Ireland has a strategy that focuses on autism training, and they're also implementing regional centers, coming back to the one-stop shop type concept. And we see positive trends that there are more countries now looking to implement strategies. Poland is currently tabling a strategy, and in Germany, although in a regional setting in Bavaria, they're also tabling an autism strategy. So when we looked at these strategies, that they're the ones that had positive impact, there were certain elements that was common to all of them. First of all, it needs to be a practical approach. And Alistair has pointed to the fact you need to listen to us. You need the identification of the specific needs. And it needs to be in close cooperation with the autism community. And it's got to be flexible. Shouldn't come as a surprise that this is what we need when we're looking at things, because the concept of one size fits all doesn't work in this community. Another element that is essential, and that is the requirements for an ongoing monitoring of that plan. And that the coordination, the level of coordination is essential. And finally, adequate public funding. So the future, the EU strategy for autism, or lack of such. There isn't a EU strategy, but what exists is, well, I'll just say the disability strategy that exists in the EU is very much towards functional disabilities. It's the access to things. There's not necessarily access to what we consider services, but access to transportation, access to various things like communication and things like that. And so it's not very all-encompassing, but what we do have, as I said, and this goes to the comment that was made earlier, a declaration on autism, which unfortunately it's not a binding text, but it highlights the commitment of the members of the European Parliament to strive for more policy actions at the EU level, and also recognizing that we actually need a European approach to autism. And this is the one that I forgot. The Work-Life Balance Directive. That's actually a law. It says that you should be afforded the time and the ability to take care of your children and that the workforce or the workplace should adjust your work conditions so that you can do that. So on a sort of closing thoughts on what the strategy should contain. I've mentioned it before, it needs to be holistic. It needs to cover the entire arenas that you come across, the entire lifespan, the entire, well, autism isn't a one-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional issue. It's multidimensional. And a plan needs to take all of that into account. there needs to be a legal provision for a plan. There needs to be an ability to enforce it, a legal venue to challenge services under that plan. You also need to specify how you should measure success. Success is, there's many levels of success, but we need to actually understand what we're trying to achieve and how to measure what we're achieving. And finally, a plan without financial backing is useless. Autism Europe has, when we're looking at things, and I think this probably fits well with the rest of the world too. It's not particularly European. These initiatives have to look at access to diagnosis, access to education, access to healthcare, access to services, access to employment, and not least, access to justice. And what's very, call it in the forefront in Europe is deinstitutionalization, and that's a word I never get right. The disbandment of all institutions. And finally, community-based services. You shouldn't, like was the Deputy Grand Chief said, have to move away from your community to get your services. Your services should be provided in your community. And that's all I really had to say. Autism Europe is co-financed by the European Union, so I should say thank you to the guys that actually make it feasible for me to do this. And again, thank you to all of you for allowing me to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists for traveling all this way and sharing your thoughtful presentations. We're going to take a quick break right now. After the break, we're going to have Senator Wanda Bernard take a deeper dive, a more informal conversation with our experts here to talk further about the actual impacts on the ground to autistic individuals and families. During the break, I invite all of you to go visit our incredible artist, Ben LaChapelle, who is autistic. He is a artist, author, and illustrator, and his work is absolutely delightful and inspiring. I also invite you to visit our exhibitors and our exhibitor booths outside. And thank you especially to the Sini Family Foundation and to the Israeli Foundation for truly making this event possible. Thank you so much, everyone.